Hello class, my name is Mrs. Scoutson and you may call me Mrs. S for short. Today we are going to be discussing divisibility for 4 and 8. So before we begin, please take out your notebook and a pencil so you can write down a couple of definitions. Then we're going to go over some examples together so we can get the hang of figuring out how to find the divisibility for 4 and 8. And then you would be doing some practice problems with your desk partner. Okay, everybody ready? All right, let's begin. Today we're going to start off by discussing divisibility of 4 first. So, to find the divisibility of 4, you need to check if the last two numbers can be divided by 4. So what it means is when you're trying to find the divisibility for a number and it's divided by 4, we can get the last two digits of that whole number and divide it by the number 4. Now we're going to go over the definition for divisibility of 8. To find the divisibility of 8, you need to check if the last 3 numbers can be divided by 8. So just like the other one, when you're doing 8, you got to divide 8, or from the digit, you have to get the last 3 numbers of that whole digit and divide it by 8 to find if it is divisible by 8. Now we're going to go over some examples so we have a better understanding of divisibility for 4 and 8. But before we go over the math aspect of it, does anybody have any questions about the definitions? No? Okay, let's begin. So the first example we're going to do is we're going to do 684 divided by 4. So what we're trying, I'm sorry. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to see if 684 is a divisible of 4. So remember, when you're trying to find the divisibility of a number and you're using 4, you have to take the last two numbers, the last two digits of 684 and divide that by 4. So the last two digits of this number are 84, and we're trying to see if it's divisible by 4. So we're going to do 84 divided by 4. Okay? So we're just going to do basic division that we've learned before. We need to see how many times 4 goes into 8. 4 goes into 8 2 times. So we're going to put the 2 up here, and then put the 8 down here. Subtract that. That equals 0. Now we're going to get the 4 from the ones place. Bring that down. And see, how many times does 4 go into 4? We know 4 times 1 equals 4. So we're going to subtract that, and it's 0. The 0 right here is the key to seeing if it is divisible. Since it's 0, and this is just 21, the key to it is that there is no remainder. Since there is no remainder, that means that 84 is divisible by 4. And since 84 is divisible by 4, we have our answer that 684 is divisible by 4. So this is correct. And lastly, what we're going to do next is we're just going to solve the division problem of 684 divided by 4. So we're going to solve that problem. So we know 684 divided by 4. So we need to figure out how many times 4 goes into 6. We know that 4 times 1 equals 4. And 4 is the closest number to 6. So 6 minus 4 is 2. Now we bring down the tens place, which is the 8. 28. So we need to figure out how many times does 4, what is 4 times what number equals 28? So we just do the multiplication, and it is 7. 7 times 4 equals 28. And then we're going to bring down the 4, and from what we learned earlier, 4 times 1 equals 4. So 4 minus 4 equals 0. And so our answer is 171. So we found out that 684 divided by 4 equals 171, and 684 is divisible by 4. Any questions on this? Okay, so now we're going to go on to the next example. So the next example that I have, second one, is 3,568 divided by 8. And from what we've learned from the definition, when you're trying to find if a number is divisible by 8, we need to take the last 3 numbers and divide that by 8. So we're going to take the number 568, since that's the last 3 digits of the whole number, and divide it by 8. So we're going to do our division. We know that 8 cannot be multiplied by anything and equal 5. So we're going to put a 0 right here, and we're going to see 8, how many times? 8 times what equals 56? We know 8 times 7 equals 56. And 56 minus 56 equals 0. We're going to bring down the 8. And now 8 times 1 equals 8. And from what we learned earlier, remember, if it's a 0, that means that there's no remainder. And having no remainder means that 568 is divisible by 8. So with us saying that, that means that 3,568 is divisible by 8. So it is divisible by 8. Now we're going to go ahead and solve the math problem. 3,568 divided by 8. So we're going to do 3,568 divided by 8. We know 8 cannot be multiplied by anything equal 3. So we're going to put a 0. And we're going to see how many times does 8, what is 8 times what number equals 35? We know that 8 times 4 equals 32. And 32 is the closest number that we can get to 35. So we're going to do 5 minus 2 is 3. 3 minus 3 is 0. And now we're going to bring down the 6, the digit 6 from the 10th place. We're going to bring that down and see how many times does 8 go into 36. So we need to find that. And we know, again, 4. 8 times 4 equals 32. And 32 is the closest number that we can get to 36. So now we're going to do 6 minus 2, which is 4. 3 minus 3 is 0. We're going to bring down the digit 8 from the ones place. We're going to bring that down, and we got to see how many times does 8 go into 48. We know 8 times 6 equals 48. So 48 minus 48 equals 0. So now we have that math problem, or the division problem. It is 446. So we did the math problems and we found that 3,568 from right here is divisible by 8. And how we found that out was because 568, the last 3 digits of 3,568, it can be divided by 8 with no remainder. And so it's divisible by 8. And then when we solved the math problem of 3,568 divided by 8, we got the answer 446. Does anybody have any questions before we move on to the next example? Okay, now we're going to go over the third and final example that I'm going to be showing you before you move on to doing some practice problems with your desk partner. So, the third example I have is 1,080 divided by 8. So again, remember, when we're trying to find if a number is divisible by 8, we got to take the last 3 digits. So the last 3 digits are 080 and divide that by 8 to find if it is divisible by 8. So there's a 0 in front of there. And remember from lessons before that when there's a 0 in front of a number and we're going to divide it, we can pretend that the 0 is imaginary, that it's not there. So what we're going to do is find 8 divided by 80. And I know that we know this on the top of our heads that 8 divided by 80 is 10 because 8 divided by 8 is 1, and then you put the 0 there. But we're just going to work out the math problem. So we know 8 times 1 equals 8. So 8 minus 8 equals 0. And now we're going to bring down the 0 from the tens place, or from the ones place, sorry. We're going to bring that down. And we know 8 times 0 equals 0. And again, there is no remainder. Since there is no remainder, we know that 80 divided by 8 equals 0, or equals 10, no remainder. So then we know that 80 is divisible by 8. And since 80 is divisible by 8, 1,080 is divisible by 8. 1,080 is divisible by 8. So now we're going to go move on to solving the math equation, which is 1,080 divided by 8. So 1,080 divided by 8. We know from the top of our heads that 8 times anything cannot equal 1. So we put a 0 right here. And we need to find how many times 8 can go into 10. We know 8 times 1 equals 8, and 8 is the closest number that we can get to being lower to 10. So we're going to do 10 minus 8, which is 2. Bring down the 8 from the tens place, and now we need to see how many times does 8 go into 28. So we're going to do the multiplication, and we know that 8 times 3 equals 24. So 8 times 3 equals 24. Now we're going to do 8 minus 4, which equals 4. 2 minus 2 equals 0. Now we're going to bring down the 0 from the ones place. We brought it down. And 40. We need to see how many times does 8 go into 40. When we do the math, we know that 5. 8 times 5 equals 40. So 40 minus 40 equals 0. So 135 is our answer. 135. So from this example, we needed to see if 1,080 is divisible by 8. And when there's an 8, we need to take the last 3 digits and see if it can be divided by 8 to see if it is divisible. We found the answer, no remainder, so we found out that 1080 is divisible by 8, and then we solved the math problem. And then we found that the answer is 135. Does anybody have any questions before we move on? No? Okay. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to write 3 problems on the board, and I want you and your desk partner to get together, and I want y'all to solve these problems. Y'all will have 15 minutes to solve the problems that I write down. And then once I'm done, I'm going to ask for 3 groups to come up, write the answers that they got down on the board, and then we'll go over it as a class, okay? Does anybody have any questions before we begin? No? Okay, let me get the answers for you. Okay, everybody, we had practice problems that I let you and your desk partner work on together for 15 minutes. The 15 minutes are up, and we had 3 groups come up and write down the answers they got for the math problems. These are the answers that they got for the math problems. Okay, now next I'm going to get another group of 3 people to come up and say if it is divisible or not divisible. Okay, here's the answers that the other 3 groups gave me. So for the first practice problem I gave you was 392 divided by 4, and group 1 said the answer equals 196, and the other group said it is divisible by 4. Okay, and the second problem was 228 divided by 4. That group said that the answer was 57, and another group said it is divisible by 4. And the last problem is 9,872 divided by 8. And that group said the answer is 1,234. And they said it is divisible by 8. Now we're going to go ahead and go over these answers together and see if they are right or wrong. So we're going to go over the first practice problem, which is 392 divided by 4. And we had the group give us their answers, and one group said that this equals 196, and another group said that it is divisible. So we're going to go over how the group got this. We're going to go over the answer to see if this is correct. And again, from what I've said before, being wrong isn't bad. It actually helps, learn for the future. Making mistakes helps the brain. So we're going to go over the problem, see if this is right and if it is divisible together, okay? So we have, first we'll see if it is divisible. So we're trying to find if 392 is divisible by 4. And remember, to see if it is divisible for 4, we got to take the last 2 numbers, so 92, and divide that by 4. So how many times does 4 go into 9? We know 4 times 2 equals 8. Okay, and then 9 minus 8 equals 1. Bring down the 2. How many times does 4 go into 12? We know 4 times 3 equals 12. So there's no remainder, so this group is correct. It is divisible. Now we're going to go ahead and solve the math problem of 392 divided by 4. So we can see here that there is already a problem with this answer, so we know that it's not correct. And we know because 4 cannot go into 3. That's the only way for 4 to go in. If we were to do 4 into 3, that would be a -1, and we can't have negatives. So 4 cannot go into 3, so we put a 0 right here. And 4, now we need to find out how many times does 4 go into 39? So, we know 9 times 4 equals 36. 36 is the closest number we can get to 39. So now we got to do 9 minus 6, which is 3. 3 minus 3 is 0. Bring down the 2 from the ones place, which is 2. And now we need to see how many times does 4 go into 32. We know 8 times 4 equals 32. So 32 minus 32 equals 0. So the answer is 98. So let's go over, we went over how we got the 1, and the 9 was correct, the digit right here. But the 6, how do you think they got the 6? So if we did it, 6 times 4 equals 24. So that is a number that's kind of close to 32, but there is a multiple of 4 that equals 32. So I do understand where you got the 6, but we just have to be mindful when we're multiplying. Make sure that we go through all the numbers to find the closest number to the digits. Does anybody have any questions? So the next question that I had for you to solve with each other was 228 divided by 4. And one group said that they got the answer that they got from this math problem was 57. And another group said that it is divisible. So they said the answer is 57 and it is divisible by 4. So we're going to go over first to see if it is divisible. So it's a 4, and from what we remember, to find if a number is divisible by 4, we have to take the last two numbers, so 28, and divide that by 4. We know that 4 cannot go into 2, so that's a 0. And we need to see how many times does 4 go into 28. So 7. 7 times 4 equals 28. And that's 0. There's no remainder, so this was correct. It is divisible. 28 is divisible by 4. So 228 is going to be divisible by 4 as well. Now we're going to go ahead and solve the math problem and see if this is correct. So 228 divided by 4. From what we saw over here, 4 cannot go into 2, so that's an automatic 0. And we need to see how many times can 4 go into 22. We saw from right here that 7 times 4 equals 28, and 28 is too big for 22. So we're going to go one number down, which is 6. So 6 times 4 equals 24. I'm sorry, we're not doing that. I don't know what's going through my mind. So let's start over. See, even teachers make mistakes, and it's okay, because making mistakes helps your brain grow. So we're going to do it again. 4 divided by 228. 4 cannot go into 2, so we put a 0, and 22. So we can see how many times does 4 go into 22. So we're going to do the multiplication. 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. So 5. 5 times 4 equals 20. And 2 minus 0 equals 2. 2 minus 2 equals 0. And now we're going to bring down the 8 And we have 28. So how many times does 4 go into 28? Let's do the multiplication. 7. 7 times 4 equals 28. And we also saw it right here. 4 divided by 28, 7. So 28 minus 28 equals 0. So the answer is 57. So this was correct as well. So what we learned from here is that 228 is divisible by 4. And the answer for 228 divided by 4 equals 57. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so now we're going to go over the last problem, which is 9,872 divided by 8. And the group said that they got the answer 1,234 for the division problem. And the other group said that it is divisible by 8. So let's start with the divisibility first. So with 8, what we remember, to find if a number is divisible by 8, we have to take the last 3 numbers and divide that by 8. So we're going to do 872 divided by 8. So we're going to start off with 8 times 1 because we know that 8 times 1 equals 8, and that's 0. We're going to bring down the 7 right here. We brought down that 7, and we know that 8 is not a multiple of 7, so we'll put a 0. And since we put a 0, we'll just bring down this 2 and 72. So now we need to see what is a multiple. How many times does 8 go into 72? 9. We know 9 times 8 equals 72. 72 minus 72 equals 0. There's no remainder, so 872 is divisible by 8. So that means 9,872 is a divisible of 8. So this is correct. It is divisible by 8. Now we're going to go ahead and solve the math equation of 9,872 divided by 8. So we know 8 times 1 equals 8. Because 8 is the closest number that we can get to 9. That equals 1. We're going to bring down the 8. And now we need to see how many times does 8 go into 18. We know that 8 times 2 equals 16. And 16 is the closest number that we can get to 18. So 8 minus 6 equals 3. Bring down the 7. 1 minus 1 equals 0. And we need to see how many times does 8 go into 37. And we know 8 times 3 equals 24. And 24 is the closest number that we can get to 37. So now we're going to subtract 7 minus 4 is 3. 3 minus 2. I'm sorry. It is 37. So we know that 4 one moment. So class, I apologize for that. It looks like I made another mistake. So let's start from 18 minus 16. So 8 minus 6 is 2. And then 1 minus 1 is 0. And now we're going to bring down the 7 and 27. So now we need to see how many times does 8 go into 27. We know 8 times 3 equals 24. So 24 is the closest number that we can get to 27. So 7 minus 4 is 3. 2 minus 2 is 0. Bring down the 2. And now we need to see how many times does 8 go into 32? 4. 8 times 4 equals 32. So now we have the math equation, the answer for it, which is 1,234. So that was correct as well. So again, what we did is we needed to see if 9,872 is divisible by 8. So we took the last three numbers, 872, and divided that by 8. And we got 109 with no remainder. So that told us that it is divisible by 8. And so 9,872 is divisible by 8. And then we solved the math problem, and we found that the answer to that problem is 1,234. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, this was a great class or a great session today, and I enjoyed going over divisibility. Just so we can go over it again, what we learned today was divisibility by 4 and 8. And to find the divisibility of 4, we have to take the last two numbers and divide that by 4. To find the divisibility for 8, we take the last three numbers and divide that by 8. We went over some problems, and we made mistakes, and we learned from our mistakes. Even I made mistakes. And so next, I'm going to give you some practice problems to take home with you and do for homework. It's only going to be 3 problems, and then the next day you'll come in and we'll go ahead and go over them together. So I'm going to write them on the board, and I want you to write them down on your math notebook for homework. Does anybody have any questions? All right, thank you, class.